Perhaps security should escort staff who can't even handle basic patient intake. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the worst night of his career began. Seattle General's ICU in Atlanta hums with the white noise of machines and the sharp tang of antiseptic. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sterile glow, each panel humming its endless mechanical song. Laura Bennett moves through the night shift like water through a filter, present but unnoticed, efficient but invisible. She refills supply carts at 0215 hours. She logs vitals without comment. At the nurses' station, 3 nurses debate the outcome of a reality show. Laura passes behind them with a stack of charts, and they never break conversation. She has worked Seattle General for 3 years, and in 3 years, almost no one has learned her first name. The locker on the 3rd shelf in the break room belongs to her. Inside, a change of scrubs, a small bottle of lotion, and a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is creased and faded, the soles compressed on the left side more than the right. No one asks why. No one asks much of anything when it comes to Laura Bennett. Dr. James Caldwell stands at the ICU entrance at 0208 hours, tablet in hand, watching her refill the crash cart with the methodical precision of someone who has done this motion 10,000 times. His eyes track the slight favoring of her left shoulder when she reaches for the high shelf, a compensation for something, though he does not care what. 3 years here and still can't make eye contact, he says to Marcus Chen, a resident standing beside him. His voice carries the weight of institutional authority, the tone of a man accustomed to being listened to. I've never seen her at a single staff event. Not one. That's not dedication, Marcus. That's instability. Marcus shifts his weight, uncomfortable. She hasn't had any complaints filed against her. Not yet, Caldwell says. The words land like a threat. Laura hears this. She does not show it. Her hands continue their work, checking tubing, verifying inventory, moving with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The trembling is not fear. It is restraint. She closes the crash cart drawer with a soft metallic click and moves to the next station without acknowledgement, without eye contact, without giving Caldwell the satisfaction of a reaction. At 0229 hours, the ER radio crackles to life. The dispatcher's voice cuts through the quiet with military precision, inbound transport. Level 1 trauma. GSW patient, 7 entry wounds, critical condition, estimated for minutes out. Military transport from Bagram. The words hang in the air. Bagram is a name that carries weight in this hospital, the airfield in Afghanistan where Delta and SEAL teams rotate through, where soldiers go in fighting and sometimes do not come back the way they left. Laura's jaw tightens. Imperceptibly. A microscopic shift in the muscles beneath her skin. But it happens. Dr. Caldwell's eyes snap toward her. For just a moment, he is curious. Then he dismisses it and moves toward the trauma bay, where nurses begin the choreography of preparation, clearing beds, opening trays, running blood products, checking airway equipment. Laura moves with them, her movements precise and economical. She has not worked trauma in 3 years. She works the ICU now, monitoring stable patients, maintaining lines, charting vitals. But her hands remember. The helicopter is audible before it is visible, the distinctive thud of rotors that makes the windows vibrate in their frames, that makes the fluorescent lights flicker and steady and flicker again. The rotor wash shakes the parking lot like artillery, and the nurses in the trauma bay brace themselves. The doors burst open. 2 medics enter first, moving with the controlled urgency of men who have seen this before, their uniforms bearing the insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. Behind them, they carry a stretcher, and on that stretcher is a man. General Marcus Hayes. 4-star General. Commanding Officer of Special Operations Divisions across 3 continents. Also, the man who recommended Laura's son Jacob for his last deployment. The man who wrote the letter that sent Jacob back into the mountains with nothing but a rifle, a radio, and the assumption he would come home. He does not look like a 4-star general now. He looks like a body in the last few minutes before it stops being one. Blood has soaked through the field dressings at least 6 of the 7 entry points. His skin has the waxy pallor of severe blood loss. His eyes are half closed, unfocused. One of the medics is calling out vitals: BP 62 systolic, heart rate 148, O2 sat 74 and falling, GCS 8. Dr. Caldwell receives him like a general receiving an important dignitary, all sharp commands and surgical precision. Get him to Bay 1. I want 2 large bore full lines, type O positive, start the level 1 infuser. Get a chest X-ray, pelvis, and C-spine. Labs to the OR, now. Who's on surgical standby? His voice carries the confidence of a man who has never been questioned, who has never failed when it mattered. Laura moves into the bay. She does not think about who the patient is. She does not think about the letter. She does not think about her son. She thinks about the 7 entry wounds and the 3 exit wounds that will or will not be there when they roll him. She thinks about the rate of blood loss and the fact that his O2 is still falling. She moves to the forecart and pulls the 14-gauge angiocath needles, her hand steady as surgical steel. Bennett. Caldwell's voice cracks across the trauma bay like a whip. Start the second line. And try not to miss the vein this time. The words are precisely calibrated to humiliate her in front of the entire trauma team. In front of the medics. In front of the patient's body, bleeding out on the stretcher. Laura does not respond. She does not miss. The needle slides into the vein on the first try, the flash of blood rising in the catheter chamber confirmation that her hands are steadier than her voice. The infusion line flows. Caldwell watches. Then he turns away, satisfied with his performance, and begins barking orders to the surgical team. But that was not the worst part. The next morning, at 0730 hours, rounds begin. Grand rounds. The kind of rounds where the attending surgeon presents cases to the resident staff, where teaching happens and lessons are reinforced and hierarchies are confirmed. General Hayes is stable for now, barely. Sepsis risk is climbing. The surgical team has him scheduled for a damage assessment in 4 hours, pending labs and imaging. Dr. Caldwell positions himself at the head of the bed. Gathered around him are 9 residents, 2 medical students, and 3 nurses, including Laura, who is assigned to Hayes for the shift. She stands at the foot of the bed, hands behind her back, her expression neutral as a mask. This is a critical case, Caldwell announces, his voice taking on the theatrical tone of a man performing for an audience. The initial trauma response will determine whether this patient lives or dies. Which makes our pre-hospital protocols absolutely essential. He pauses. Turns to Laura. Nurse Bennett, can you walk us through the initial assessment? Perhaps explain why you decided to deviate from the standard intake protocol on arrival. The words are structured like an accusation. His tone is structured like a verdict. He is not asking a question. He is staging an execution. Laura's voice, when she speaks, is quiet. I followed standard protocol. Airway, breathing, circulation assessment. 2 large bore lines. Blood products initiated. Core imaging ordered. Yes, yes, Caldwell says, and the dismissal in his voice is audible to everyone in the room. But the order of your interventions. You prioritized. What did you prioritize, Nurse Bennett? She does not answer because the question is designed to have no correct answer. The question is designed to make her fail in front of 9 residents and 2 medical students, to make sure everyone in this room knows that Caldwell does not trust her competence, that she is a nurse who got lucky, nothing more. I prioritized hemodynamic stability, she says quietly. Against protocol, Caldwell says. He is not stating a fact. He is establishing a narrative. Against the documented standard of care. And yet somehow the patient survived the night. Lucky for you. He turns back to the residents. Let this be a lesson in why we have protocols, people. Not because we like paperwork. But because improvisation kills patients. What Nurse Bennett did was improvise. None of it is true. All of it is true if you squint at it right and listen to the tone. The residents scribble notes. One of them glances at Laura with something that might be pity or might be contempt. She does not know which is worse. The rounds move on. Hayes's chest X-ray shows shrapnel migration. His labs show evidence of rhabdomyolysis from the crush injury to his right leg. His urinalysis is dark with myoglobin. Everything is wrong. And Caldwell takes credit for every decision that might prevent his deterioration and assigns the failure of every system to the team members he dislikes. At 1,407 hours, Laura is at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She is not hungry. She is not thirsty. She is trying to exist somewhere that is not the ICU for approximately 3 minutes. The machine hums its electric song, indifferent to her presence. 2 nurses round the corner. Sarah Chen and Amanda Reeves. They work the pediatric ward and have no reason to know Laura exists, which is why they speak freely. Did you see Laura Bennett in Grand Rounds? Sarah says. The mouse who can't even order her own coffee. The word mouse lands with the precision of a blade. Caldwell absolutely destroyed her in front of the entire surgical team. Amanda laughs. A sharp sound without kindness in it. I've never seen her speak to anyone. She's like a ghost. Probably why she can't handle actual patient care. They are still laughing when Caldwell rounds the corner from the stairwell. He sees them. He does not smile exactly, but his mouth does something adjacent to it. He passes Laura at the vending machine without acknowledgement, but he speaks loudly enough for her to hear. Pressure in critical care isn't for everyone. Sometimes people reach their competence ceiling early. I'd hate to see someone struggle in a role where lives depend on their stability. He glances at the 2 nurses. Security can be very helpful in those situations. For everyone's sake. He walks on. The message has been delivered. The audience has been confirmed. The narrative has been established. Laura Bennett is unstable, incompetent, and should not be trusted with critical patients. Laura does not move. She does not speak. She does not cry. Her breathing is normal. Her heart rate is normal. Everything about her is normal, because she learned a long time ago that the people who break are the people who let it show. Later, at 18:34 hours, alone in the supply closet on the 4th floor, her breathing comes shallow and fast. Just breathing. Nothing more. The trembling in her hands is not visible to anyone because no one is watching. She stands in the dark between boxes of gauze and tubing and lets her lungs work harder than they should, lets the panic have its moment where no one sees. But she does not cry. She does not break. She does not call out sick. She does not quit. At 19:23 hours, Laura logs into the hospital email system to review her shift notes. There is a message in her inbox, CC'd to 17 addresses including the hospital board, from Dr. James Caldwell. The subject line reads, "Concerns regarding fitness for critical care, a nursing staff." She reads it once. She does not read it twice. She knows what it says. She logs out. She finishes her shift. She walks to her car in the parking lot where the rain is beginning to fall, and she does not think about the letter. She does not think about what it means. She does not think about the next morning, when this narrative will be official, when her competence will no longer be a question asked in private but a documented concern in the hospital's personnel file. She drives home through the Atlanta night, and the rain falls on the windshield like applause. The morning of day 2 arrived like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their electric hymn, the hospital breathing its steady rhythm of beeping monitors and rubber-soled footsteps. Laura had been awake since 4, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, hands folded across her chest where a scar tissue landscape mapped out her real history. She didn't think about Caldwell's email. She didn't think about the way his voice had dripped condescension in Grand Rounds, or the sound of residents laughing behind clipboards. She thought about breathing. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Steady. By 1400 hours, General Marcus Hayes had survived 36 hours on pure stubbornness and Seattle General's trauma protocols. His vitals were stable, not good, not safe, but holding. Laura had checked them herself at 13:45, watching the cardiac monitor trace its methodical peaks and valleys, watching the oxygen saturation climb to a respectable 91%. The 7 bullet wounds were cleaned and closed. The internal bleeding had been managed. The worst, everyone said, was behind them. Then the alarms began. Not the soft chime of a routine alert. The full-throated scream of the cardiac monitor, that sound like a siren splitting the air of the intensive care unit, the noise that stops time in a hospital ward and makes every nurse's spine go rigid. Laura was at the medication cart, restocking syringes. The sound registered in her body before her brain could process it, pure animal recognition of crisis, the same way a Marine recognizes incoming fire. Code blue, ICU, bed 4, the intercom crackled, but everyone already knew. The alarm was screaming it. Bed 4 was General Hayes. Laura moved before thought, her feet crossing the threshold into the ICU wing where the chaos had already begun. The monitor was flatlined, that terrible flat line that meant a heart had simply stopped beating, given up, surrendered. Hayes's blood pressure had collapsed to barely measurable, 40/20. 40/20 meant you had minutes. Minutes meant you were already dying. Dr. Caldwell burst through the double doors like a man possessed, his surgical mask already in place, his gloved hands already up. He didn't pause for assessment. He didn't ask questions. He moved directly to the head of the bed and his voice cut across the chaos with the authority of a man who had performed this dance 1,000 times. Chest open. Now. Let's crack him. The surgical saw appeared in his hands like it had materialized from will alone. Laura watched him position it, watched the blade bite into the general's sternum with that particular sound, wet and clean and absolutely final. The ribs spread open under the retractor, the chest cavity exposed like the guts of a machine, all blood and tissue and the machinery of keeping a human being alive. The pericardium opened. The surgical field filled with blood immediately, dark and ancient and pooling faster than the suction could clear it. Caldwell's hands were inside Hayes's chest now, performing open cardiac massage, pushing the heart directly between his palms, pumping blood through a body that had forgotten how to pump it itself. 1 compression. 2. The room went silent except for the sound of the ventilator and the rhythm of his hands and someone calling out vitals that were dropping faster than the numbers could register. Blood pressure still falling, one of the residents said. 60/30 and dropping. We're losing him. Caldwell's jaw was set. His movements were precise. He was competent, there was no question about that. He knew the mechanics of keeping a human being alive when all the normal systems had failed. But competence and knowledge are different things sometimes. Knowledge is what you learn from textbooks. Competence is what you learn from bodies. And in a chest full of shrapnel from a Bagram ambush, there was a kind of damage that textbooks could not prepare you for. There's too much hemorrhage, Caldwell said, his voice staying level, his hands still moving. There's shrapnel everywhere. I can't locate the primary bleeder. Where is the bleeding coming from? 60 seconds of open cardiac massage. 90 seconds. The monitor remained flatlined. 2 minutes. The heart was dead or close enough that it made no difference. Laura stood at the foot of the bed, 3 feet away from the surgical field, her eyes locked on Hayes's exposed chest cavity. She could see what Caldwell could not, or rather, she could read what he was looking at the way a musician reads a score that the audience cannot hear. The shrapnel damage was extensive, radiating outward from the left anterior chest. 14 months ago, Hayes had taken a bullet there. It had gone clean through, missed the cardiac structures by centimeters. That old wound site had created scar tissue, dense and fibrous, and now new shrapnel was hidden behind it like a poisonous secret waiting to be found. The bleeder was the left subclavian artery. It had to be. The pattern of hemorrhage, the location of entry, the way the blood was pooling, it was all textbook Kandahar wound, the kind she had seen twice before in field conditions, the kind she had held together with her hands while waiting for a medevac that might never come. She took one step forward. Caldwell's head snapped up like she had shouted at him. His eyes met hers across the open chest cavity, his hand still moving, still pumping a heart that had stopped hearing the signal to beat. "Step back, Nurse Bennett. This is a sterile field." She took another step. The words came out of her mouth quietly, with no inflection, no request in them. They were a statement, a correction, the way an instructor might say the angle is wrong or the approach is incorrect. "Doctor. The bleeder is posterior to the old wound site. Subclavian artery, posterior wall. There's scar tissue blocking your line of sight." Caldwell's face flushed red in an instant. "I said step back. You are not a surgeon. You are not authorized to be." "The patient is exsanguinating," Laura said. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave. It now carried the weight of certainty, the tone of someone who had made a diagnosis in conditions where being wrong meant bodies stayed on the ground. "If you do not locate and clamp that artery in the next 90 seconds, General Hayes dies. His heart cannot compress anymore. The monitor is flat-lined. We have no perfusion. 90 seconds. For a moment, Caldwell seemed about to respond, to assert his authority, to remind her of her station. His mouth opened. His hands continued their mechanical rhythm. And then the monitor flatlined not just electrically but functionally, no response to the chest compressions, no attempt at organized rhythm, nothing but the flat line that meant a body had made a final decision about whether it wanted to keep living. Laura moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed the sterile field and her hands were gloved in seconds. She didn't remember reaching for gloves, didn't remember pulling them on, just knew that her hands were inside the chest cavity alongside Caldwell's, her fingers moving through the blood and tissue with the kind of muscle memory that lives in the nervous system and doesn't require thought. The subclavian artery was where she knew it would be. The scar tissue was thicker than she expected but also exactly what she expected. Her left hand moved aside the adhesions, the fibrotic tissue, creating an opening. Her right hand found the torn vessel, found it the way a hand finds a specific key in a dark pocket, with absolute certainty. The artery was still bleeding, the blood coming in pulses because the heart was gone, the perfusion was gone, the patient was gone, except that Laura's hands knew how to hold him back from being gone. Satin sky clamp. Now. A nurse, not Caldwell, someone else, someone who understood that there was a voice in the room carrying authority, passed her the clamp. Laura applied it with the kind of precision that only comes from having done the exact same thing in the desert while dust storms rolled across the horizon and medevacs circled on their way. "Push 1 milligram epi, 4, Laura said. Her voice was giving orders now. Her voice owned the room. "Then amiodarone, 300 milligrams. And get me internal paddles. We're going to shock him." This man's heart didn't fail because it was tired, it failed because the blood stopped pumping out of his chest. Now that the bleeding's controlled, we bring him back. The internal paddles arrived. The medications went in. Laura's hands positioned the paddles directly on the heart muscle, the tissue she could feel beneath her fingers still soft with something that wasn't quite death yet. "Clear," she said, and everyone in the room understood that the word meant something different when it came from her voice. 200 joules. The heart jerked under the current, convulsed, and then, there. A blip on the monitor. A single beat. Then another. Then a rhythm. Slow at first. Erratic. But real. The heart was firing again. The heart had come back. Caldwell had backed away from the surgical field without being asked. He stood at the head of the bed now, watching, his surgical mask still in place but his hands down at his sides. His face had gone white, then red, then the color of old paper. He was watching a floor nurse perform open cardiac massage while calling for medications in a voice that belonged to someone who had done this 1,000 times in conditions he couldn't imagine. "Blood pressure coming up," a resident said. Disbelief in his voice. 70/40. Climbing. "Oxygen saturation," Laura said. 85. 88. 90. The monitor was showing what looked almost like a legitimate sinus rhythm now, not perfect, but organized, purposeful, the electrical system of a four-star general's heart deciding that it wasn't finished yet. Laura's hands were still in the open chest cavity, maintaining the satin sky clamp, keeping the bleeding controlled while her mind was already 5 steps ahead, already calculating what came next, what had to be done now that the immediate crisis had been stopped. She could feel Caldwell's eyes on her. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room. But she didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge them. She was focused on the singular task of keeping a man alive, and everything else, every question about who she was and how she knew what she knew and what her hands had just done, could wait. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm while the general's heart pumped on its own, no longer dependent on Laura's hands. She pulled off her gloves with deliberate precision, one finger at a time, the latex peeling away with a soft whisper of sound. Blood marked her forearms to the elbow. Her face remained perfectly neutral as she stripped the second glove, turned, and walked toward the sink without a word. Dr. Caldwell stood motionless in the center of the trauma bay, his sterile field contaminated, his authority dissolved in a single moment. The residents exchanged glances, quick, urgent, confused. Someone's foot scraped against the tile. Someone else's breathing came shallow and fast. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the power shift that had just occurred in its presence. Caldwell's jaw tightened. His hands, which moments ago had frozen over an open chest cavity, now curled into fists at his sides. He watched Laura wash her hands with methodical care, each movement deliberate, each gesture the work of someone accustomed to protocols more rigid than any hospital could enforce. The water ran clear. She dried her hands on a paper towel without turning around. Everyone! Out! Caldwell's voice carried the brittle edge of a man watching his constructed reality fracture. Except you, Nurse Bennett. Stay. The residents filed out in silence. The trauma bay cleared until only 3 remained, Laura, Caldwell, and a general whose life now extended beyond what medical textbooks suggested was possible. Caldwell's breathing came deliberately controlled, the kind of breath work a man uses when he is trying very hard not to shout. He moved toward her. 6 inches from her face, his voice dropped to a register designed to carry only between them. You just ended your career. I don't know where you learned to play surgeon, but you will never touch another patient in this hospital. Not again. His finger pointed at her like a weapon. You violated every protocol we have. You contaminated a surgical field. You performed a procedure you are not qualified to perform. And you did it all without authorization. Laura's eyes met his for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away, her expression the kind of mask worn by people who have heard worse threats from worse people in worse places. She did not respond. She did not defend herself. She simply turned and reached for her badge on the supply cart, the small metal rectangle catching the fluorescent light as her fingers closed around it. Caldwell's phone was in his hand before her badge was clipped back to her scrubs. Within the hour, 4 phone calls had been made from his office. The first was to Richard Bancroft, the hospital board chairman, a man who had donated $3.2 million to the cardiac wing that bore his family name. Caldwell's voice carried the measured tone of a colleague sharing urgent concerns about institutional liability. You need to understand what just happened in Trauma 4, he said, his words constructed with the precision of a man building a legal case in real time. A nurse with questionable credentials just assumed surgical control of a critical case. If that patient had died, we would be liable for gross negligence. She performed procedures outside her scope of practice. She contaminated a sterile field. She verbally overrode a surgeon's direct orders. This is a serious compliance issue. The second call went to Dr. Marcus Chen, Caldwell's residency classmate from Johns Hopkins, now serving as chief medical officer at Emory. The conversation was framed differently but carried the same message. I'm dealing with a situation here that concerns me, Caldwell said, his voice taking on the confidential tone of a professional sharing peer concerns. A staff nurse just performed what appeared to be advanced surgical interventions. I'm wondering if you've encountered similar credential inflation in your facilities. It's becoming a trend in nursing, and I'm concerned about where it originates. The third call was placed to the admissions office at Grady Memorial School of Nursing. Caldwell had pulled Laura's application file from the personnel office, a document that listed her educational history with deliberate vagueness. He spoke to the registrar, a woman named Patricia, with the confidence of someone conducting a routine verification. I'm conducting a credentialing review for an employee, he explained, and I need to confirm the authenticity of credentials listed on an application from approximately 11 years ago. Laura Bennett. Yes, that's correct. She indicates completion of your RN program. Can you walk me through what that program entails? Specifically, what surgical training is included? I'm asking because she performed advanced procedures today that seem inconsistent with standard nursing curriculum. The fourth call was to Dr. Harlan Pierce, a surgical consultant from the American College of Surgeons who owed Caldwell a favor from a research collaboration 5 years prior. This conversation was the most carefully constructed. Harlan, I'm documenting an incident for peer review purposes, Caldwell said, his tone carrying the weight of professional responsibility. A staff nurse intervened in a surgical case, took control of the field, and directed my actions. I'm building a file on credential verification and scope of practice violations. I'm going to need your support as an external voice if this escalates to litigation. Can I send you a summary? Thank you. I thought you'd understand the seriousness of this. By 1847 hours, Caldwell had initiated contact with 14 individuals across medical administration, nursing credentials, hospital liability, and peer oversight. He crafted a narrative that was technically accurate in its facts but lethal in its implications. A nurse had performed surgical procedures. A nurse had violated protocol. A nurse had contaminated a sterile field. A nurse had overridden physician authority. Each contact received a version of the story shaped specifically for that recipient's concerns. With the board chairman, it was liability and institutional risk. With peer physicians, it was credential fraud. With the nursing school, it was verification of training. With external consultants, it was documentation for legal protection. Caldwell's phone became an instrument of precision, each call another thread woven into a tapestry designed to trap her, to discredit her, to make it impossible for anyone to believe that what she had done was anything other than dangerous overreach. Laura knew none of this. Not yet. She was in the staff locker room at 1923 hours, changing out of her scrubs, the fabric still damp with the general's blood. She had worked the rest of her shift with mechanical efficiency, vitals checked every 15 minutes, medications administered on schedule, documentation completed with meticulous accuracy. She had not spoken to Caldwell again. She had not spoken to anyone. She had simply moved through the hospital with the same quiet competence that had characterized her work for 3 years, and nobody had seemed to notice that anything had changed. But in the back pocket of her locker, next to her personal items, sat a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan, the leather creased and weathered, the soles marked with sand that had never quite washed away. She touched them without removing them, her fingers brushing the familiar texture. The boots had carried her through Kandahar, through Sanjan Valley, through a night in Helmand Province where she had held a tourniquet on a fellow operator's leg while rounds impacted the wall 6 inches from her head. They had carried her into Seattle General on her first day as a civilian employee, and she had hidden them ever since, a talisman for a woman who no longer existed. At 1947 hours, her phone buzzed. A text from Jacob, Mom. Dad called. He said something about your hospital. Something about Dr. Caldwell calling him? What's happening? Laura's hands went still. She stared at the message without responding. In the fluorescent light of the locker room, alone with the echo of her own breathing, she understood what was happening. Caldwell wasn't just making calls within the hospital. He was calling families, weaving his narrative into the personal lives of the people who employed her, the people who trained her, the people connected to her. He was building something systematic. Something coordinated. Something designed not just to wound her but to erase her. The locker room remained silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Laura's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hands, which had held a general's life in their palms just hours before, now trembled with something that was not fear. It was restraint. It was the kind of control exercised by someone who had learned long ago that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. But that patience was about to be tested in ways even she could not yet anticipate. The clock on the wall read 0900 hours when the security guard appeared at her locker. Not the usual guard who waved at her most nights. This one was different, rigid posture, hand resting near his belt, eyes trained straight ahead. Laura was finishing her notes on General Hayes's fluid balance when she saw him. She didn't need to be told what was coming. 23 years in the service had taught her to read the room before anyone spoke a word. "Nurse Bennett. HR needs to see you. Now." She closed her laptop, logged out of the system, and walked behind him through the corridors of Seattle General. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead. 2 more security guards waited outside the HR office on the 3rd floor. A lawyer in a charcoal suit stood when she entered. That was the moment she understood the full machinery Caldwell had set in motion. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Reeves who had never spoken more than 5 words to Laura in 3 years, sat behind an oak desk with a folder open. Inside it, Laura could see photocopies of emails. Her own handwriting from patient notes. Printouts from what looked like her personnel file. Caldwell had been thorough. Caldwell had been meticulous. "Nurse Bennett, please sit." Patricia's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script written by lawyers. "Laura Saturday. Dr. Caldwell has submitted formal documentation regarding your clinical performance, credential verification, and adherence to hospital protocol during the trauma response on day 1 of General Hayes's admission." Laura's hands rested in her lap. Still. Steady as a surgical laser. He has also filed concerns directly with the Georgia Board of Nursing, requesting investigation into whether your credentials were properly verified during your hiring process. Patricia's eyes didn't meet hers. That was always how people handled it when they knew they were wrong but had no choice except to proceed. The hospital administration has elected to err on the side of caution regarding patient safety. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. 11 words. That was all it took. You will turn over your badge and credentials. Security will escort you through a brief bag check as a formality, and then you'll be escorted from the premises. Do you have anything you'd like to say? Laura could have said many things. She could have explained about the classified operation in Kandahar, the one that was buried with 14 others under direct order from JSOC. She could have explained about the extraction, the fire, the decision that came down from above. Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett is deceased. All records scrubbed. A new identity, a nursing degree earned through night school, a fresh start that was supposed to be exactly that, fresh. Clean. Safe. She could have said her real name. She couldn't prove it. No, Laura said. The lawyer slid a termination letter across the desk. Laura didn't read it. She'd already read one before, 5 years ago, when she was declared dead. The bag search took for minutes. They opened her locker in front of her, ran their hands through her spare scrubs, checked the pockets of her jacket. They found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find. Everything that could have proven who she was, the discharge papers, the medal citations, the service record, had been erased from every database the moment the helicopter lifted off from Bagram airfield with holes in its fuselage and blood on the deck. The shrapnel in her left shoulder remained, though. That they couldn't remove. That was still there, metal fragments embedded in bone, a map of survival written in scar tissue that no database could ever scrub clean. They confiscated her badge. The laminated photo on it was 3 years old, her hair longer then, her face still carrying the weight of someone who hadn't yet learned how to walk through a hospital lobby without being called a mouse. The walkout was the longest walk of her life, and she'd walked across deserts under fire. She passed General Hayes's room on the way. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. He was awake now, the crisis past, his vital signs climbing back toward something resembling normal because she had reached into an open chest cavity and found what 3 years of surgical training had taught Caldwell to miss. She didn't look at the room. She kept her eyes forward. The nurse who passed her in the hallway, one of the two from the vending machine, the ones who'd laughed about the mouse who couldn't order her own coffee, stepped back against the wall. That was interesting. Word traveled fast. Dr. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station as she approached. He was watching her. Waiting for something, tears maybe, some visible cracking of the composure she'd spent 3 years building like brickwork around herself. His face carried the expression of a man who had just won something he'd worked very hard to destroy. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. Men like Caldwell carried their victories in their jaws, tight and satisfied, the way a predator carries the knowledge that the prey had nowhere left to run. Laura didn't acknowledge him. She walked past. The badge on her empty scrub pocket was gone. The name on it was gone. The woman who wore it was becoming something else again. The parking lot was empty except for the usual collection of staff cars baking under the Atlanta heat. Her hands didn't shake as she gripped her steering wheel. The trembling, if it had come, would have been restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly what you could do in this moment and choosing with absolute precision not to do it. She drove for 40 minutes. Not home. Not anywhere that made sense. Just away from the hospital, away from the city, out to the commercial strip on the outskirts where the neon signs reflected in the rain-wet parking lots and nobody cared who you were or why you were here. She pulled into the parking lot of a diner called Mel's, the kind of place that had been in business for 30 years and looked like it hadn't been updated since 1987. The coffee was terrible. She ordered it anyway. Black, no sugar, and took a booth by the window where the neon sign for Miller High Life flickered against the glass. It was 0300 hours. The diner was nearly empty, a man at the counter reading a newspaper that looked like it was from yesterday, a waitress with her feet hurting and her shift ending in 45 minutes, nobody else. Nothing but the hum of the coffee machine and the distant hiss of the espresso steamer. Laura stared at her reflection in the window. The dark glass turned her into a ghost, translucent, barely there, the kind of person who could dissolve into the background and never be found. That had been the point 5 years ago, hadn't it? The point of all of it. Disappear. Become someone else. Become someone safe. Her phone sat dark on the table next to the coffee cup. No calls. No messages. No one knew where she was because no one had reason to look. Her apartment lease was month to month. Her car was paid for. Her bank account had been carefully built to require no explanations to anyone. Everything about her life had been constructed with the understanding that it could be dismantled in a single afternoon by a man in a suit making phone calls. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She was still staring at her reflection when the rain began to hammer the parking lot outside, each drop a small percussion of finality, as if the sky itself was reinforcing the narrative Caldwell had written. The quiet nurse who couldn't handle pressure. The imposter who had fabricated her credentials. The woman who had no business being in an operating room, much less saving the life of a 4-star general. She thought about Jacob. Her son. 17 years old, still 2 months away from his 18th birthday, still sleeping in the bedroom down the hall from her apartment, still calling her mom with the kind of casual affection that most soldiers never got from anyone once they enlisted. He didn't know about Kandahar. He didn't know about the 13 other operators who came home in flag-draped boxes because the extraction had taken too long. He didn't know his mother was supposed to be dead, her name struck from every official record, her service buried under the weight of classified operations and JSOC protocols that existed in a space beyond even congressional oversight. He just knew she was a nurse. He just knew she worked nights. He just knew she came home tired and made him eggs in the morning before his shift at the hospital maintenance department, a job he'd taken specifically to stay close to her, to keep an eye on her the way parents were supposed to keep an eye on their kids, which meant she had failed him in every way that mattered. What would he understand when he found out she had let them erase her? When he learned that the woman who had pulled a 4-star general out of an ambush in Bagram, who had taken a bullet doing it, who had spent the last 5 years teaching herself to be invisible in a hospital corridor, had simply accepted the erasure one more time. The rain hammered against the window like a code she couldn't quite decode. The waitress refilled her coffee without being asked. "You okay, hun?" the woman said, and Laura replied with a nod that conveyed nothing, because the truth was too long to explain to a stranger at 0330 hours in a diner where the formica on the tables was worn smooth by 10,000 cups of terrible coffee held by people with nowhere else to go. She didn't know that her phone was about to ring. She didn't know that her son was already awake, already moving, already gathering the things she had hidden in the garage of their apartment 5 years ago, the things she had sworn never to show anyone, the things that proved she had been real once, that her service had mattered, that something about this erasure was temporary. She only knew that the reflection in the dark window was someone she no longer recognized, and that this time, there was no one to pull her out. At noon, the main entrance doors of Seattle General crashed open like a vault breaching under pressure. Jacob Bennett stood in the threshold, 17 years old, with his mother's sharp eyes and something heavier in his hands, a shadow box, the kind that holds more than objects. It held proof. It held truth. Security moved toward him with the tired efficiency of hospital staff trained to handle disruption, but Jacob's voice cut through the lobby before anyone could reach him. "Mom, they need to see these." Not a question. Not a plea. A statement delivered with the same measured certainty Laura used in a trauma bay when every second mattered. He raised the shadow box higher, and for exactly 3 seconds, the fluorescent lights overhead caught on glass and metal and something that looked like gold catching fire. A veteran security guard, 63 years old, 22 years with the VA before transferring here, the kind of man who had stood at parades and watched full-dress uniforms, went absolutely rigid. His posture shifted. His breathing changed. Something in the bone structure of his face reorganized itself into recognition. When he spoke, his voice came out parade ground loud, the kind of volume that belongs to formations and dawn ceremonies and the moment when a room understands it is standing in the presence of something it had no idea was standing there. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck." Not a shout. A declaration. An announcement. A statement of fact delivered in the language of respect. The lobby didn't just go quiet. It understood itself differently. The fluorescent light seemed to dim by several lumens, not because they changed but because everyone's pupils dilated simultaneously. The coffee cart stopped steaming. The volunteer at the reception desk stopped moving. 3 hospital staff members turned in unison, the way flocks of birds change direction, not because anyone signaled them but because the air pressure in the room had fundamentally shifted. The Pentagon team that had arrived 6 hours earlier and been waiting in a third-floor conference room for authorization suddenly had the authorization they needed. They moved as a unit toward the boy holding the shadow box, the way trained operators move when they have confirmed a target location. The colonel at the front of the group, 48 years old, combat decorations that covered his chest like a constellation, pulled a tablet from his briefcase and began reading without preamble. No introduction. No context. Just information delivered with the precision of someone reading from classified documents that were about to become slightly less classified. Operation Phantom Reach, January through April, Bagram Forward Operating Base, the colonel said, his voice carrying the flattened effect of someone reading testimony. 18 personnel extracted under fire from a Taliban ambush in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. 18 lives saved by 1 combat medic operating under conditions that exceeded every operational guideline. He looked up from the tablet, and his eyes found the trauma bay corridor where Laura had walked that morning, not as a nurse, but as something the hospital had tried to erase. That medic is Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, retired. The finest trauma surgeon this military has ever watched work without a medical degree. General Marcus Hayes sat in a wheelchair 15 feet away, his left leg still bound, his shoulder wrapped in enough surgical gauze to account for the shrapnel that had embedded itself in bone and tissue and memory. His eyes were still the color of storm weather, but they were clear now, clear in the way eyes become clear when they have stopped fighting for oxygen and started fighting for purpose. He looked directly at Dr. Caldwell, who stood frozen near the cardiac monitoring station, his white coat suddenly looking like a costume someone had borrowed without permission. The general's voice came out steady, the kind of steady that comes from a man who has given orders under fire and watched people live or die based on whether those orders were followed exactly. This woman took a bullet in Bagram, pulling me out of an ambush. Small arms fire, 7.62 mm, entered through her left shoulder and lodged against her scapula. He paused. The pause was 12 seconds long. It felt like 12 minutes. She has more shrapnel in her shoulder than I have in my leg. And she was carrying me at the time. The room stayed silent for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds is longer than most people think. In 10 seconds, a person can cycle through disbelief, understanding, shame, and the beginning of reckoning. Caldwell's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the architecture of his world had suddenly revealed itself to be built on sand, and the tide was coming in very fast. What happened next came in stages, each one a careful descent. For days later, at 6:33 in the morning, FBI agents arrived at Caldwell's home with a warrant that had been signed by a federal judge at 2:53 a.m. The charges read like a catalogue of desperation: falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, attempted concealment of evidence relating to classified personnel, and forgery of documents with the intent to deceive government investigators. The agents had logged every keystroke. The Pentagon's counterintelligence unit had been monitoring his computer since Laura's termination, a precaution taken because he had been dismantling the records of a deep-cover operative whose existence was still technically classified. Every forged document he had created in the dark hours of the morning, every altered date, every fake complaint he had backdated, every signature he had fabricated on nursing school correspondence, all of it had been captured in real time, archived, and prepared for prosecution before he even finished erasing his browser history. The perp walk happened at 7:13 a.m., right at shift change, which meant every camera in Atlanta was already positioned at the hospital. News crews caught him in handcuffs, his face twisted into something that looked like the moment a man understands that his entire constructed reality has been transparent to everyone except himself. The images ran on every local station and were picked up by the networks: a renowned cardiac surgeon, 12 years of influence, a reputation built on a foundation that had been quietly rotting the entire time. The hospital board announced his suspension within the hour. By noon, his medical license was under formal investigation by the State Board of Medicine. By 3:51 p.m., he was requesting a lawyer, which came too late because there is no lawyer who can unfabricate documents that the FBI has already catalogued in triplicate. 2 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, Jacob sent his mother a photograph. He didn't text it. He printed it and handed it to her in the break room at Seattle General, the same break room where she had stood at the vending machine and listened to nurses laugh about the mouse who can't even order her own coffee. The photograph showed Dr. Caldwell behind a folding table at a strip mall off Buford Highway, selling insurance policies. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His savings had been depleted by legal fees. His reputation had been erased so thoroughly that he couldn't get hired at a walk-in clinic in rural Georgia, so he had pivoted to the only profession that would accept him, selling policies to people who had no idea who he had been, policies with margins so thin that he would never again experience the abundance he had grown accustomed to. His eyes in the photograph had the look of a man who understood, finally, that power was not something you accumulated through credentials and strategic phone calls. Power was something that either lived in your hands or didn't, and his hands had never actually held anything real. Laura kept that photograph in her locker at Seattle General, right next to the pair of worn combat boots she had carried home from Bagram. The boots were cracked at the heel. The laces were frayed. They smelled like dust from San Juan Valley and the metallic memory of blood, her own and others. She kept them because some things stay buried only as long as they need to, and when they surface, they change the landscape they emerge from. She returned to the night shift, which was what she had wanted all along. The Pentagon had offered her return to active duty. She had declined with the kind of politeness that meant no negotiation. She preferred the quiet hours, the patients who didn't ask questions, the work that mattered in the way that things matter when no one is watching. General Marcus Hayes, recovered and returned to limited duty, had written a letter to Jacob that read simply, your mother is the finest soldier I ever served with. Tell her that matters." On her last shift before Jacob's college graduation, a young nurse, fresh out of nursing school, still learning which patients would recover and which were already deciding not to, asked about the boots in the locker. She asked casually, the way you ask about anything unusual in a shared space. Laura almost didn't answer. Then she did. Her voice when she spoke had changed again, had deepened into something that carried the weight of decisions made in darkness with no time to second-guess them. "They're from when I learned that rank doesn't matter in the dark. Only what you're willing to give." She closed the locker. Her hands moved with a kind of precision that only comes from muscle memory built over decades of saving lives while the world wasn't looking. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She returned to her rounds without waiting for a response. Other staff members stepped aside as she passed, not out of fear, but out of the kind of respect that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. The quiet nurse moved through the fluorescent lights like a shadow that had learned to give light instead of take it, and the hospital, for the first time, recognized what it had always held within its walls. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and then forced to prove what you were capable of, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment with your own story of quiet strength. The world needs to know that true power often walks among us unrecognized until the moment it absolutely matters.